Internet. Today we're going to be talking about the somewhat controversial notion of the therapist charging for missed sessions. So let me preface this conversation by saying that there's a whole wide range of reasons why we charge when the patient isn't there. And there's historical reasons, there's economic reasons, there's setting reasons, and there's also just reasons of respect between two individuals. Now, I'm going to try and do my best to go through this whole spectrum of ideas. But remember, I might have missed something, as fundamentally I'm only one person, so feel free to add something if you want in the comments or to talk about it. There's no issues and there's no worries, right? So anyway, this rule on the face of it might seem quite unfair to the patient, because they might be thinking, well, why do I have to pay something that I didn't consume or that I didn't use? But what's important here is that it might seem unfair, but there is many reasons why it has to happen and why it has to, in a way, be used by the therapist. So let's start with a historical reason. What you have to understand is that Freud created this rule as basically it was commonplace in Vienna in his day and age. And even people like music teachers would charge money if the music sessions were cancelled. So it was common practice at the time. But what Freud did was to say that it was important because the patient had to understand the value of the psychotherapy. That it was not some act of friendship or pro bono. It was really you are investing something of yourself into it, and that deserves respect. And if you can't be there, that means that in some way you are not basically investing in yourself. Therefore, the money is a guarantee of your own investment in the therapy. This argument, even though it's been used so many times, I think has many flaws. Because, truth being said, there is many ways of investing your time and energy. It's not just about the money. And especially, I've never been a fan of this argument that the more money you invest, the more worthwhile it makes you. That, I think, is really dubious, right? It isn't that much about the quantity of money, rather than the regularity. However, I do agree that there is certain situation in which the fact of paying is a form of investment on oneself. But I will go back to the setting later on. What you have to understand is that historically, that's what Freud prescribed the field to do. And basically the field has kept it for the most part. And here I'm going to be very nuanced, because some therapists do apply this rule and some don't. And this is regardless of the schools of thought. I've met CBT practitioners that do this, and I've met, strangely enough, psychoanalysts that don't do it either. So everyone is free to apply the rule in some way, shape or form. But the vast majority of people I personally have met and which I've talked to apply the rule in some way, shape or form. And I myself apply it in a certain way. How I apply it is, the session is due, if it's not cancelled, 24 hours in advance, unless, and this is important, there's a major life event. Like, for example, a relative of the patient dies, their child needs to be hospitalized, they fall ill and they can't come. So I do have some form of leeway, and this is more talking about me rather than the field in general, because I think personally that a patient should not pay if they could not come. Like, if it's not a choice of the patient or them forgetting, if they really are barred from coming because there's some force majeure, right, as we say in French, i.e. an extreme event, then that's different. Then there's something of the will of the patient is no longer there, so therefore it's not about investing. So this is my personal perspective. There's also, and I'm sorry to say this, but there's also a very baseline level of the therapist needs to basically guarantee that they are able to continue psychotherapy. So what do I mean by that? I mean that fundamentally, even though for the patient it might seem unfair that they have to pay for something that they've missed or something they've forgotten, what you have to understand is that at the end of the day, the therapist can only provide therapy because they can make ends meet. If you cannot make ends meet, then you will no longer be able to provide the therapy. You have to be able to pay your bills, to feed your family, to pay your rent, and so on and so forth. And often there's a lot of added costs to psychotherapy that patients might not be aware of, like professional insurances, like for example rent, or basically charges that might apply that basically you don't advertise as a therapist, but do basically take away from the money you're getting off the patient. And of course taxes, government expenditures for the company, and so on and so forth. So fundamentally, this makes it that you need a certain form of guarantee, and paying for missed sessions purely economically is a guarantee for the therapist that they can make a living. Very simply. So now that I've basically talked about the economic and historic levels of this issue, let's move on to the questions of setting. Because although I disagree with Freud's "you need to invest because it's important for you," I do agree that sometimes for certain patients it is essential to have this rule. Because for certain patients, then, for example, notably those who have a borderline level of personality, i.e. everything ranging from borderline to narcissist to schizoid to antisocial and so on and so forth, might have this tendency to believe that therapy is just a level of friendship, that there's a friendship between the therapist and the patient. However, the setting, in this case, the setting has to be used to make that difference, to separate both parties from this illusion of we're friends. Because fundamentally, this is not friendship. We're working with the patient to achieve a common goal, yes. But this is not one talking about oneself and the other one answering that, and being there for each other. You as a therapist are there to help the patient and to be there for them, but they are there to focus on themselves and to try and help themselves with your help and to make something out of your help, right? But they're not there, they're never there to alleviate your own issues. Never. So fundamentally, this is even though there's transference and countertransference and both parties remain human, of course, this is about the patient, always. So fundamentally, when we are making the patient pay for missed sessions, we are basically removing that element of friendship from the relationship, because you're not gonna make your friend pay for something that's missed, right? But the patient does. And there's also this very important fact that often some patients, as I said, with a certain form of personality organization, might feel that they are special, that they should basically transcend the rule, that they should go beyond the rule. And missing a session can be a form of test from these types of patients to see if you're going to make them pay or not, to see if they are somewhat special in your heart, that they're so worthwhile that for you as a therapist that you're going to basically make an exception for them. So this can be a trap for the patient, because once you engage into the free missed session, it can give the patient basically the illusion that this is something more than psychotherapy, that this is a real relationship. It's also, and I think that this is also important to state, a form of respect towards the patient. So it might seem very odd to say it like that, but what I mean is that making the patient pay is also making the patient accountable, giving them agency. Because we're not saying something like, oh yes, no, I completely understand, don't worry, I'm okay with it. We are basically reinforcing the fact that no, the patient has a choice. And that we're not infantilizing them by saying, no choice. No. We are basically telling them, you've made a choice, Now you have to be accountable for your choice. And I do think that that's a certain form of respect towards the patient. We're not treating them as children. We are quite the opposite, treating them on the same level as we're treating ourselves, that we have to be accountable for our mistakes and errors as therapists, and they have to be accountable for not coming to therapy. And this is basically a way also of showing them what is a genuine relationship, that both parties have to be on equal footing and have to be mutually respectful of each other, and really having to this line allows them to basically be able to build it in other relationships. Also, the respect of the setting can also help the patient absorb the setting. That even though they might be very frustrated, very angry, very rageful that they have to pay the missed session, in the long run, it might help them understand the boundaries of what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, what they can basically get away with, what they can't get away with. And they might even, for some patients even, this fact of paying missed sessions might be a form of reparation, that for them it's showing that the relationship survives even though something is basically has gone wrong. That they, through their money and through the fact of paying it, can fix the sin that went wrong. And they don't fix it in an emotional level. They don't fix the therapist. They don't try and fix the therapist as they would fix their parents, right? They just give the money that they owe, and that's it. And the relationship is back on track. So a form of easiness in fixing it, because you just need to pay what is due, right? And I think that this is very important. So I think that this rule of paying missed sessions is incredibly important, because it's giving back agency to the patient. It's also a form of respect and a way of basically helping the patient understand, play with, and absorb basically the setting and the right distance from person to person. There's also this, I was talking about respect, there's also, at least this is how I conceive of it, the respect of, fundamentally, of the time of the therapist. Because when you're thinking about, you're blocking a time for someone, you are not taking anyone else during that time. So therefore you are basically wasting the time for the patient. And when I mean wasting, I mean you can do something else, you can basically have another form of activity during that time, but the idea is that fundamentally that time was saved or was reserved for that person. And it's also a question of respect towards the therapist and to pay that money, because it is a time that was dedicated to you and or the patient, let's say, and the patient chose not to basically use it. It's also a form of, you have to come to terms with what you do or don't do. So again, very important. And very fundamentally, I do think that this rule is justified in many regards. That the patient might not realize it, but in the end, this rule most of the time allows the ongoing process of psychotherapy, that it's a rule that preserves both parties. And I think that often people miss that and feel that they directly go to some form of unfairness with the rule. Whereas, in a way, it's important for the patient to be able to invest, because when the patient isn't coming, he's also, in a way, paying that. In a way, this space is still guaranteed even if he's not physically there. And some psychotherapists and psychoanalysts spend that hour when the patient isn't there thinking about the patient, trying to elaborate on what has happened in therapy and try and understand them, so that when the patient comes back, they can fundamentally give the best interpretation. So some therapists even work during that, let's say, lost hour, right? And lastly, and perhaps importantly, is that this, and this may seem strange, but paying for missed session gives the patient complete freedom. It gives them freedom to express feelings of anger, feelings of frustration towards a therapist, to be able to basically come back whenever they can pay what they are due. It gives them a form of agency, which I was talking about earlier, but beyond the agency, a form of freedom, which I think is essential because in psychotherapy, power dynamics, are very unilateral. Most patients feel that they have to follow what the therapist has to say or the psychologist because they're the experts. But the fact of basically having to pay for missed session really equilibrates this relationship and makes it more, how can I say, more unilateral, that both are on the same ground, which I think is so important. So very fundamentally, this was everything I had to say about it. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, anything you would like to ask, or anything you would like to add, feel free to do so in the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.